Okay, everybody that's in the Mommy Berries community here. I am Mel from Mommy Berries, and I'm on a mission to help women feel more proactive and I would say kind of ahead of the game, that they're keeping up with their pregnancy and postpartum recovery instead of feeling like they're always picking up the pieces. When I found this area, that's what I was doing, picking up the pieces. And I would say that's where my clients started. And lately there's this surge of people wanting to stay ahead of everything and educate themselves. And so I really liked this platform, not only to help kind of provide information I have, but also collaborate with other people that also have excellent information that is suitable for all of you going through pregnancy and postpartum recovery. And Gina and I were just talking right before I hit record here about, I couldn't remember exactly how I found her. But if you haven't already seen Gina's content on MamasteFit, are you just on Instagram, Gina, or do you have like a Facebook platform?
I'm on Facebook too, but Instagram is where I really do a lot of. Facebook isn't as good for like sharing. It's like, I think it's Facebook is more for like family and friends kind of.
Totally.
So I have more going on Instagram, but I do have a Facebook page as well.
Cool. And I'll link this at the bottom when we're done talking, but her Instagram account is just fabulous I'm drawn to other people that use visuals and use other props and tools to kind of explain things to you. Because I think it's one thing to say, do this, but it's another thing to explain why. And I think you do a really good job of that. And so when I was asked to start talking a little bit more about vaginal birth prep and specifically for VBAC moms, I wanted to reach out to you because I've seen some of your great content. So thanks for taking the time for everybody else.
Of course.
Will you tell us really quickly kind of like, how did you, I'm sure kind of you found this area with having your own pregnancy and childbirth too, I'm guessing, but why don't you just tell everybody about yourself, a little bit, your background?
So my name is Gina Conley. I'm located here in the United States in North Carolina, sometimes Virginia, depending on whose house I'm staying at. I got into this field after the birth of my daughter. I was actually active duty Army and transitioned out of the military after her birth and was trying to figure out something to do. And so I ventured into pre and postpartum fitness training initially. And then one of my clients asked me to be her doula. So then I started to venture into the birth realm. And then after getting some experience working with clients at their births, I started to venture into the childbirth realm. And so I have my master's in exercise science. And so everything that I kind of look at is from a anatomy and like a physiological like perspective. Because so much about birth is really scary because we don't understand it, not necessarily because it's this mysterious, like never knowing thing. Like, sure, there are things that like we can't always explain or we don't always have control over, but we can definitely understand what is happening during birth. And when we understand things, we become less afraid of them. And that applies to pretty much everything in life, but especially for birth. For most of us, our only experience with birth is our own. Not very many of us experience other people's birth. There's not really this community support with birth anymore that used to happen like centuries or decades ago. And so it's a really unknown experience, and it's kind of scary. And you also really only ever hear the horror stories where people telling you how horrible this was, how painful it was the worst. And it doesn't have to be. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to have an unmedicated birth by any means. Like, you could still have an incredibly powerful birth with an epidural, but birth doesn't have to be scary when you understand with it. And when you are connected with the process, you kind of know what to do a lot better. And there's something really powerful with being in tune to the experience as well. So trusting our intuition as birthing people, like, you're going to be the smartest person in the room about your birth experience, whether or not you believe it. The other people that are there to support you are experienced with birth in general, and their expertise are valuable. But you know what's happening in your own body. It's sometimes really hard to believe and trust that, because so much of pregnancy and of birth and just being a woman is someone else telling you that you don't know better and that they know better than you. I think pregnancy is probably the one time in my life where I've received so much unsolicited advice that I never asked for. So that's kind of my mission, is to help empower women to feel confident, knowledgeable about birth, and I try to explain it in a way that just makes sense, as opposed to being like, just lay some crystals out and light a candle and feel the energy of whatever. Like, I'm not anti-crystal or like holistic approaches, but when you understand like this is what is physically happening with your uterus when you have a contraction and that's why you feel this, you're like, oh, that's not scary anymore. And so that's kind of my goal, is to make birth less scary.
Awesome.
Adeline, you're kicking him in the face.
I love it. And that's what I always say, like, put yourself in the driver's seat instead of just feeling like you're only the passenger, right? Because you're right. It's just kind of, you feel like you're at the mercy of someone else all the time. And there's more that you can, like you said, there's so much you can't control, but there's actually things you can control every step of the way to feel like you have a bit of control, right? I kind of thought this would be interesting to kind of just take it chronologically. And let's say someone comes to you and says, okay, I want to have a vaginal birth. And I mentioned that we want to do a little special education for those preparing for a Vbac. So we will touch on that, but it's all vaginal birth. I want you to, like, let's say someone comes to you and says, Gina, I'm looking to be proactive. Like, where do I start in preparing for my vaginal birth? And what would be one of the first things that you suggest?
So usually the two things that I really recommend would be your physical fitness. So being in some sort of fitness program. One, it should be some sort of exercise that you enjoy. I'm biased towards the strength and conditioning because I think there's so much benefit to weightlifting throughout pregnancy. However, if you don't like lifting weights, like, you shouldn't be forced to lift weights. If you enjoy walking or you enjoy whatever activity, like, continue to do that and to be healthy. So exercising throughout pregnancy is linked with shorter duration of labor, like less interventions, less assisted delivery, less C-section rates. And I think the reason is not because like lifting weights means you're going to have a faster birth, but lifting weights or exercising means that you have more endurance and more stamina and your body is stronger, so you can maintain an upright position longer. You can move longer before you feel like you need to rest. And that's what makes labor shorter, is movement. So exercising throughout your pregnancy, starting at the beginning, I think is really important. I have people that start really late in their pregnancies, and you can start as late as you want. Obviously, the earlier, the better. Something else that I usually recommend when it comes to physical fitness is to also really focus on trying to do things that help with like pelvic stability. So I'm real big on like the myofascial slings. So we have various movement slings in our body that cross the pelvis. And I have a bunch of blog posts on this as well that'll explain it more in depth. But when we have like simultaneous activation within these slings, it helps to stabilize the pelvic joints. And so that's something that's been really huge for a lot of my clients, is for comfort throughout pregnancy. If we do weight training, it helps with comfort. The other side though, is we don't want to just be really, really strong. We also want to be supple and to have the mobility. Hello. We want to be able to move in a full range of motion. Like, we don't want to only be contract, contract, contract. We also want to be able to lengthen and elongate, and also relax, which is something huge for, especially for the pelvic floor. Can we sit down, please? Thank you. So when we come to the physical, we want the strength training, and then we also want the relaxation portion as well. If yoga isn't your thing, it wasn't mine, it's okay. If yoga is your thing, then continue to do it. And that's great. On the other side of the physical is the mental aspect. So I would start doing things to help prepare myself mentally to feel confident about my ability to give birth. So these are things like taking childbirth education courses and starting to educate myself on what does normal birth look like? Like, can I watch birth stories? Can I watch like birth videos or listen to positive birth stories that are allowing me to understand that normal birth is very likely to happen. And it's totally possible. I think a lot of us get told so many horror stories that we're very like not confident in our ability to give birth, especially if you've had a birth before that you didn't want. So if you weren't planning on having a C-section before and you had one, sometimes it's hard to feel confident that, oh, my body can do this. The other aspect is educating yourself with childbirth education, feeling confident in yourself. So something that's going to help support that is choosing your provider. And that's something that you should do pretty early on. So sometimes we're limited on the provider that we can choose based on our area and just who's available. Some of us don't live in big cities where we have 15 different clinics to choose from. Some of us live in areas where if I want the provider that I want, I have to drive 2 hours, especially for like the Vbac moms. Sometimes the provider in your area is not going to support your Vbac in the way that you want. So finding a provider that aligns with your birth desire is going to be really helpful, as opposed to having the provider in your area that doesn't align and trying to force them to support the birth that they're not going to support. Because then you're just going to be fighting the whole way. So instead of fighting it, you can find someone that already aligns with you and that is already supportive and believes in your power. So we just did like an interview about home birth versus hospital birth, and the bigger thing wasn't where do you give birth, but rather who do you give birth with. So are you giving birth with someone that truly believes in you and your power to give birth in the way that you want to give birth? Or are you giving birth with somebody who's like, let me save you from this experience because there's no way that you could ever do it on your own? And there's a big difference between those two mentalities, and they unfortunately both, or fortunately the first one exists, but unfortunately the second one also exists in various birthing locations. So preparing for throughout pregnancy by being physically fit, you don't have to work out every single day for 5 hours, like at least like 3 or 4 times a week is pretty sufficient. And then also the mental preparation, which is going to include both like surrounding yourself with positive stories, believing that you can do it by taking childbirth education courses, and then also choosing your provider and ensuring that your provider aligns with your birth desires so that you guys are working together as opposed to against each other throughout your entire birth, preparing for birth. So those are the biggest things that I would say are important for preparing for birth.
Yeah. And I do a lot of like, obviously, like I'm a physical therapist, so I see a lot of people that come in and their care provider sends them as in, go see someone so you have more knowledge about your body, like as far as exercise goes, modifying exercise. But also I'm starting to get so many more moms come in and just say, can you help me understand my pelvic floor? Right. And I think it's great that people are getting this information, and to know that in preparation for a vaginal birth, like understanding, like you said, the physiology, and that knowing that I think a lot of women, like you touched on, there's this focus on like be stronger in the pelvic floor, learn how to push with your pelvic floor, but understanding the physiology and noticing, no, like it's actually your uterus that will contract and push out a baby, and the pelvic floor forms the outlet, like the opening of the vagina, right? And so a lot of them are coming in and saying like, I've never thought about my pelvic floor before, and what things can I do to prepare that? And so I do a lot of the same education and helping them like feel like, what does it feel like when my body's kind of like tight and uptight, and how does my body feel when it's relaxed and when my pelvic floor feels relaxed? And we talk a lot about like, you can't always control the inputs, like, do you know what I mean? Like pain or the circumstance, but you can choose what your body does with that. Like you can choose, how to respond to that, whether it be through different positions or different visualizations or different breathing techniques. And so I'm assuming that's all stuff that you go through in your course as well. But I wonder if what do you suggest? I go through a lot of, first of all, like with or without internal exam, I show them what it feels like to relax versus tighten their pelvic floor. I show them what different positions feel like. And I ask them to just go home and practice, because I say there's no perfect position. There's no research that says you have to do this position first and then second, but just knowing that there's different options and they all feel different and they all do different things, with the pelvis. And so I suggest they go home and practice them. I usually say, just like anything, you need to practice it to feel it. And I wonder if I usually say, I get them to practice what it feels like to be kind of relaxed versus contracted, so at least they can feel the difference, and then get them to really focus on that relaxation and how it feels in different positions. And I wonder if you, like, what do you tend to suggest? Do you send people home with that? Like with preparation for positions and pushing? Because that's another thing I get asked about, practicing positions, pushing, visuals. Like, do you send them home practicing that?
So I break down what are the biomechanics of your pelvis, what are different movement patterns that are going to open the various levels of our pelvis. So one part that opens is going to close another part. And so I break down like when baby is in this spot in your pelvis, these are the type of movement patterns that you tend to do, which are intuitive, and you're already going to be doing them on their own. But when you understand it, you could see it in yourself. And then we can enhance it with more movement. And so I'll give them different suggestions, but I break down like, okay, the top of the pelvis, the inlet is going to be open from really wide knees and tucking your butt underneath. So the very top, the more I spread my knees, so external rotation of my femurs, and then also tuck my butt underneath is going to open that space more. So find movements that do that. Explore movements. Here's 10 suggestions. Try those ones and then see what else you can kind of come up with. And then we'll go down to the mid pelvis. So the actual bony structure of the pelvis that baby is passing through. These are the movements that they take through. This baby is going to rotate and descend through this portion of the pelvis, sideways and diagonal type movements, uneven hip movements, open that space more. So here's a bunch of suggestions. Here's a bunch of pictures or different movements. Go home and practice them and figure out, okay, this one makes sense. This one doesn't feel good in my body. This is how my partner can practice supporting me in these positions. And then your partner is familiar with them. And then we have, these are pushing positions that you can try. These are the mechanics. So we want knees in, ankles out, or they're going to spread those sits bones apart from each other. And then allowing there to be space for the sacrum to move. So you would think, well, if at the top I'm tucking my butt, I should arch my back for the bottom, but not necessarily. So for pushing, we just want we want there to be space for that sacrum to move around. And so I'll give them a bunch of different suggestions. I was like, but ultimately with all of these positions and ideas, you're the one that's going to kind of decide it as you go, or you're going to be like, this is what feels good for me right now, and this is what I'm going to do, and you'll change it. And it's about you being able to understand like, oh yeah, I remember Gina talking about that. I'm sensing that in my body now. My baby must have rotated and has descended now. And so it gives you more confidence that you're making progress, which I think for a lot of Vbac moms while they're in labors, they're like, well, last time I gave birth, I stalled at 4 centimeters and then I had a section, or last time this part of my labor failed or didn't work, and so there's a lot of like anxiety of like, well, what if it happens again? But when you understand the physiology of it, you can see it happening in your own body when you're giving birth. You're like, oh, my hips are moving side to side now. This must mean that my baby's engaged fine. And they're like, that's really cool. It feels different now. And that's usually what I'll kind of cue clients like as a doula. I'm like, hey, you're doing something different now. Does it feel different to you? Do your contractions feel more intense? Like, what are you feeling? And then they're like, oh yeah, it does feel different to me. And so like you said, there is no like, do these 4 movements and your baby will fly out of you. Like, just like there's no like, do this one exercise program and everything will be perfect. It's everything's led by the person. So you labor how you want to labor, you push in the position that you want to push, and you breathe the way that you want to breathe. And yes, there are ways that are a little bit better than others that if you have any sort of like ability to be conscious of what you're doing, you can kind of cue into, or have other people around you that kind of like, hey, instead of screaming, let's try this. Yeah, I don't know if that answered. So
totally, because I think
I would totally say explore it during pregnancy, see what feels good, because and then be open to whatever.
Exactly. That's what I always say is like, just practice it, because they all feel different. There'll be some where you feel like the heavens are opening and that might lead you to that position. But also if your care provider is like, I need you in this position right now, it takes away some of that fear. It's like, oh, it's okay. I've practiced in this position. I still know some visuals. I have some cues that work for me. And again, passing the favorites on to your care provider to your support, to your support network. Let's just quickly touch on, where do you suggest people start in the early postpartum period? I mean, I started Mommy Berries with a program that was meant for the early postpartum period, because I was noticing all my clients were missing the early rehab, all of it, like the neuromuscular connection and just kind of connecting with everything on a very basic level. So that's where I suggest people start. But I know that you offer some postpartum programming too.
Oh, buddy. Yeah, so my programming starts closer to like the 4 or 6 week mark. I like to leave that like really early rehab portion to physical therapists. Because I think hey buddy, hey. Oh. Are you just sad? Are you so sad? Yeah. You just want to pass me? What?
I'm almost done with Mom Bud.
Here. Is that better? So we do have a postpartum fitness program that starts probably around the 4 to 6 week mark. For our C-section, I usually recommend anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks, depending on your individual healing. And so usually what I'll find is people who are like, oh, I feel awesome, or I feel great, like I'm 2 weeks or I'm 2 days postpartum, and I'm like, slow your roll real quick. Because there is a lot that you can do in the early time frame. I just don't break it down for people because I feel like that's a little bit outside of my scope, and I don't feel comfortable walking them through it quite yet. But yeah.
Awesome. I think like just to tie it up, just because I wanted initially to make this feel applicable to all the Vbac moms, all of the information I know is very much that we talked about very much applies to anyone preparing for a vaginal birth. Is there anything that you feel like special considerations for Vbac moms that we haven't covered? I mean, I think that everything we talked about is very much going to support them. I think that finding the right care provider is probably one of the number one gems. But is there anything that we didn't touch on that you feel like that population should know?
So I would say for VBAC moms, scar mobilization is something that's really important to do. It just supports overall function so much more. In addition to it, sometimes when you have like adhesions, especially within the uterus, it can cause it can kind of restrict space for baby as well. So babies' positions aren't random. They go where there's space available for them. And if there's a restriction towards the front side of the uterus, or even within the muscular wall there, it can really decrease that space there. And maybe that's what's preventing baby from being able to rotate to be more anterior. So I would say scar mobilization, like after a C-section, whenever your care provider clears you for it. Usually I find that physical therapists do a little bit better of a job of walking clients through how to do it. Already almost done. But yeah, scar mobilization I think is something else that VBAC moms should be looking at doing throughout their pregnancy. And I think the other thing is to kind of just chill, because I feel like and I think this probably applies to anybody who's had a birth that they didn't want and they're trying to achieve something different, is I need to do all the things. If I don't do all the things, then if I have another C-section, then I'm going to blame myself for not going to that chiropractor, not eating these dates, not taking this oil, and so I think there's this huge list of do all of these things and then you'll have a VBAC, and if you don't do them all, you won't. And so it's just relax. You don't have to do all those things. Just
trust in the process.
Yeah. So I would say if you're a VBAC and you're feeling kind of overwhelmed by the laundry list of things you need to do to prepare for birth, just prioritize 2 things. Pick 2 things on your list and be like, okay, today I'm just going to focus on my fitness and making myself feel in a good mental space. All right, tomorrow I'm going to focus on picking my care provider. Okay, today I'm just going to eat my dates or whatever. So I don't feel like you need to do every single thing every single day, because it's just going to stress you out. So pick 2 or 3 things that work and then focus on those things. And then maybe the next day you do something else, who knows? So scar mobilization, and then don't worry about the long list of things to do. You can still have a VBAC and not do any of them.
Totally. Anyways, Gina, thank you so much for your time. You nailed it with 2 kids running around you.
I know. My husband just got home too.
Perfect timing. Anyways, thank you so much for all your wisdom, and enjoy the rest of your day, okay?
All right. Thank you.